British Challenger 2 tanks have stormed into Russia as part of Ukraine's stunning lightning cross-border raid into Kursk, but it appears at least one of them has been hit and may have been destroyed by a Russian Lancet drone.
Kharkiv again, and this is assailant yet. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Events have been dominated by Ukraine's spectacular cross-border assault into Russia's Kursk province, which is today in its 10th day. Ukraine says it has captured 1,000 square kilometres, and the latest update was continuing to advance at about a mile a day, although the pace of advance has slowed down. Russia suggests they have stabilised the front lines, but they've admitted, officials have admitted in a briefing to President Vladimir Putin that Ukraine captured around 500 square kilometres. So the estimates of who holds what vary, but nonetheless, by any measure, this is Russia's worst defeat on home soil since the end of World War II, and a spectacular humiliation for Vladimir Putin, undermining his image as the Kremlin strongman protecting the motherland. What we've seen in large quantities of Ukrainian troops, armoured vehicles and tanks, including at least that one Challenger 2 crossing the border from Ukraine's Sumy province into Russia's Kursk. We've seen officials in Kursk declare a state of emergency and officials in neighbouring Belgorod declaring a state of emergency. Russia says it is evacuating almost 200,000 people, and it's been forced to move reinforcements, both, we think, from the Ukrainian front line and indeed from Kaliningrad, Russia's exclave on the Baltic coast, into Kursk province to try and shore up its defences. And satellite images have shown Russian soldiers frantically digging trenches and fortifications to try and slow down this Ukrainian advance. We've also seen footage shared by the Ukrainians of large numbers of Russian prisoners of war who appear to have surrendered to the Ukrainian attackers. Now, as of today, President Vladimir Zelensky says that Ukraine is in the process of setting up a military commandant's office inside the territory it controls. So this is not a military headquarters, but this is effectively a military governor's presence to maintain law and order, because in that territory which they control are still a number of Russian citizens. Zelensky said today that Ukrainian forces had captured and had control of the town of Sudzha. Now, Sudzha is it's one of the closest, in fact, it's the closest major town to the Ukrainian border. We know Ukraine's forces are much further into Russian soil, by some estimates more than 25 miles. But the Institute for the Study of War, in their analysis, cautioned that just because Ukrainian forces have advanced does not mean necessarily that they control all of the territory that is behind them. Today, Russia released footage which it says shows a British Challenger 2 tank on Russian soil being hit by a Lancet drone. And that footage appears to show a Challenger 2 tank racing down a track between two open fields before we see an explosion next to a patch of forest. And we've also seen here at The Sun a still image which appears to show a close-up of the aftermath of that explosion. And it's clear we can see the barrel, what appears to be the barrel of a Challenger 2 tank, distinctive shaped barrel, surrounded by scorch marks and fallen trees and debris. But it's not clear from that photograph what happened to the tank or its crew. Russia claiming it was destroyed. We've had no official confirmation from the Ukrainians. A lot of questions about what this offensive hopes to achieve, is likely to achieve. Well, I think it has already achieved a huge amount, because after months and months of absorbing steady, costly losses, ceding ground in the face of relentless Russian bombardments by those devastating glide bombs, artillery and infantry assaults, Ukraine has captured the momentum. They've transformed the narrative of the war, because suddenly not just us, but everyone who's following the war is talking about this surprise attack on Russian soil. they've achieved what many said was impossible. In a battlefield saturated with spy drones, surveillance sensors, and watched by satellites, Ukraine has managed to achieve the element of surprise. And they've hit Russia where it was weak. Instead of trying to throw themselves against the fortified defences as they did last summer against the Surovikin line in Zaporizhia, we've seen Ukrainian forces throwing themselves against poorly prepared and ill-equipped border guards, and that is probably why they've had such success. It is Ukraine that now appears to have the momentum, and they have smashed that myth of Russian invincibility. Now, Ukraine, this is not the first time they have done it. In fact, I would say it is at least the fourth time they have done it. But Russia did enter this conflict when it invaded Ukraine with a sense that its victory was inevitable. We saw Ukraine's heroic defense of Kyiv. They destroyed that myth there and then. We saw later when Russian forces collapsed in Kharkiv in the face of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, we saw Russian forces retreat from Kherson. So at least 3 occasions previously in this conflict, we've seen Russia on the back foot, and now we see Russia on the back foot again. And why is that important? Well, because despite all the promises from Ukraine's allies, including from here in the United Kingdom, to help them for as long as it takes, everyone likes to back a winner. And in the face of those relentless Russian attacks, there was a risk that Ukraine and its allies would be sapped of their will to fight when they were facing the prospect of years of relentless slaughter. That appears, for now at least, not to be the case. Of course, it's too early to tell if this is a turning point, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is a significant milestone in the war. It hasn't stopped the fighting elsewhere. Russian forces have continued to make their slow and steady and expensive advances, expensive in terms of lives, in terms of the numbers of soldiers they're throwing at the fight. They've made those advances, some in Kharkiv and some to the southeast of Pokrovsk. But for the time being, that is not the most important movement on the battlefield. The most important movement on the battlefield by a country mile is what we're seeing unfolding in Kursk. Nor has Ukraine stopped its offensives in other parts of Russia. For many, many months we've seen these long-range strikes, and indeed on the night of the 13th to the 14th of August we saw Ukraine launch what it said was its largest sustained drone strike against Russian airfields. Now, one of those airfields was in Kalino, that is just outside the city of Kursk, the capital of the region that they are busy attacking. Now, that's about 60 miles from the Ukrainian border, but we also saw them hit at least 3 others. There was the Savasleika airfield in Nizhny Novgorod. Now, that was the furthest. That's some 400 miles from Ukrainian territory. Borisoglebsk airfield in Voronezh, that's 200 miles from the closest Ukrainian territory, and Baltimore airfield also in Voronezh, a little bit closer, about 100 miles from Ukraine. Now, this is part of that sustained campaign to hit Russian airfields, to put at risk the aircraft which are launching those devastating glide bomb attacks against Ukraine. The theory is if Ukraine can force those aircraft backwards, because it puts those airfields at risk, force the planes to fly further, they will have to carry more fuel, which means they can carry fewer bombs, which means they will be less effective against Ukraine. We've also seen in the last few days, yesterday, reports that Ukraine had shot down an Su-34 fighter bomber, an aircraft worth about £30 million, which is one of those aircraft which is used to drop these glide bombs. All of those airfields I just mentioned, according to Ukrainian military officials, have been used to launch those glide bomb attacks. They also host other strategic, long-range Russian bombers. Military officials claiming that the targets at those airfields were their oil and fuel storage depots, making it harder in the long run for those aircraft to use those bases. So not targeting the aircraft themselves, rather targeting the infrastructure they need to operate from those bases. Finally today, before we get on to the questions, we're going to talk about the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. You'll remember it in the September 2022, about 7 months into the war, there was an explosion, sabotage attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines which connect Russia to Germany. a number of reports coming out of both the American media and the German media suggesting that Ukraine was behind those attacks. Germany has issued arrest warrants for a Ukrainian national, which it has named only as Vladimir Z, who they say was resident in Poland at the time of the attacks. They've also released a picture of him as a scuba diver, suggesting that he was involved. A more detailed account has emerged in the Wall Street Journal, suggesting that this was a plan hatched by a drunken group of Ukrainian officers who initially went to President Vladimir Zelensky for approval. He gave the approval, according to this account, but then later ordered them to call off the operation under pressure from the CIA. Now, the Wall Street Journal account suggests that General Valery Zaluzhny, who was at the time the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces, ordered them to continue. They hired a German yacht, the Andromeda, sailed out into the Baltic and conducted those attacks. President Zelensky's office has categorically denied that account, that he had anything to do with it. He'd previously denied being aware or being involved. As ever, if you do have any questions and you're watching on YouTube, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as we can in next week's show, or if I can't do that, I'll get into the comments myself and answer there as well. A couple of you asking about A-10 aircraft. These are the American Air Force ground air support aircraft known as Warthogs, and whether or not they might be, the phrase that keeps coming up is game changers, but whether or not they might be able to help Ukraine and why haven't they been provided. These are 45 years old, these aircraft. They've been in service with the US military for a long time and they're due to be retired. I direct you to the comments, I think, of Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, who was testifying before House Armed Services Committee, made the point that actually Ukraine hasn't asked for them. Ukraine doesn't appear to want them. There have been long-standing concerns that these aircraft are too vulnerable to be used on the modern-day battlefield, and they would likely be shot down. There is a counter-argument that were they used closely with F-16s to provide air support and air cover, that they could in fact be effective. The short answer is Ukraine does not appear to have asked for them thus far. Now that they have the F-16s, that could change. Second question, staying on aircraft, is have the F-16s been used in anger? Not certain. I haven't seen concrete proof of these aircraft being used in combat yet. President Zelensky did last week confirm that the first F-16s had arrived. And as we said, we expected them to be used as air defense assets to shoot down potentially Russian aircraft, but more likely Russian missiles, Iranian drones that are being launched at targets inside Ukraine. The final question today is, will Russia use nuclear weapons? Now, we've had that question many times, but it's particularly pertinent given what's happening in Kursk. Russian nuclear doctrine describes that nuclear weapons may be used when the motherland is threatened. Now, the motherland is clearly under attack. Ukrainian forces, Ukrainians armed with British tanks, are fighting on sovereign Russian soil. But whether or not the Kremlin would consider that a threat to Mother Russia as a whole, I think is uncertain. What Ukraine has captured, between 500 and 1,000 square kilometers, is an area, 1 or 2 times the size of the Isle of Wight. It's a relatively small, it's significant, but it's a small amount of territory. They're not about to march on Moscow. Nonetheless, a lot of people suggesting that this offensive might trigger an escalation, and I would say in response to that, well, what else can Russia do? It's not as if Russia has been holding back for the last 2.5 years. Moscow has unleashed almost every conventional weapon in its arsenal. It's ordered in huge quantities of dumb munitions from North Korea, drones from Iran. It feels to many like the only escalatory step left to Moscow would be to use nuclear weapons, now most likely tactical nuclear weapons. On that, I would direct you to the comments of Lord George Robertson, a former NATO Secretary General, who said that he thought those tactical nuclear weapons would have no military utility in Ukraine. He said that were they dropped, they would likely damage Russia because the radiation would more than likely blow back on Russia, and any use of nuclear weapons would immediately alienate China and India, who at the moment are Russia's two most powerful allies. And he believed that Russia couldn't take that risk. So for the time being, we cannot rule out that risk that Russia will use nuclear weapons. We constantly hear these saber-rattling threats from President Putin, from his aides in the Kremlin. But it's a risk. For now, it seems unlikely. Again, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can next week.